The warning came at the edge of known space, a desperate transmission from a dying outpost. Static crackled through the message, but the words were clear enough to chill the blood of every human who heard them. "They're coming. We held as long as we could, but they're coming." Then silence. For decades, the galaxy had known peace. An uneasy one, perhaps, but peace nonetheless. Humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through superior numbers or advanced technology, but through sheer will. Other species called them relentless, stubborn, even reckless. But when the galaxy needed protectors, when war threatened to consume entire civilizations, it was always the humans who stood on the front lines. Commander Elias Voss watched the transmission on repeat. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. He had seen the aftermath of too many battles, the lifeless stations drifting in cold space, the worlds left in ruin. This time, he would not wait for the enemy to strike first. He turned to his crew aboard the Resolute, the last remaining warship of its fleet, and spoke with quiet certainty. "We're going after them." His officers exchanged uneasy glances. The enemy wasn't just some raiding force or rogue faction. The Zelri were conquerors, an ancient species that viewed other life forms as little more than pests. They moved through the galaxy like a wildfire, consuming everything in their path. No one had ever stopped them, not truly. Some had slowed their advance, but the Zelri always returned, stronger, hungrier. Lieutenant Mara Solis folded her arms, her dark eyes sharp with skepticism. "You mean to say we're charging straight into the unknown? Alone?" Elias nodded. "We're never alone." A quiet murmur ran through the crew. He wasn't wrong. Humanity had allies. Species who had fought beside them in past wars, who owed their survival to the stubbornness of Earth's defenders. But would they come now? Would they risk everything for another war? "We send out a call," Elias continued. "Not just to the ones who owe us. To everyone. The galaxy stands or falls together." Mara exhaled, shaking her head with a reluctant smirk. "Hell, I knew I signed up for something crazy." The message was sent, but there was no time to wait for an answer. The Resolute set course for the abandoned outposts, its engines burning like a beacon in the dark. As the ship neared the station, the crew braced for what they would find. Bodies. Wreckage. The last signs of resistance before the Zelari swept through like a storm. But the station wasn't silent. Something still moved in the shadows. A distress beacon blinked weakly, barely functioning, yet sending out a pattern that felt oddly deliberate. Mara frowned, adjusting the ship's sensors. "Commander, I think someone's alive in there." Elias didn't hesitate. "Then we're bringing them back." As the docking clamps engaged, a cold feeling settled in his gut. The Zelari never left survivors. If someone was still in there, they either weren't human, or they had a reason to be kept alive. The airlock opened with a hiss, revealing the station's dimly lit corridor. Elias stepped inside, weapon drawn, his breath steady despite the tension crackling around them. The station was quiet. Too quiet. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice. Weak, strained, but unmistakably human. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a chill through Elias, because if the Zellerid had left a message behind, it meant they knew humanity would come, and worse, they were waiting. Elias froze at the sound of the voice. It was weak, but steady, carrying a weight that made his fingers tighten around his weapon. The dim corridor stretched ahead, flickering emergency lights casting long, shifting shadows. The station was dead. Yes, someone was still here. Mara stepped in behind him, her pulse rifle raised. "Identify yourself," she called out. Her voice was firm, but Elias could hear the edge of caution in it. For a moment only silence answered. Then footsteps. Slow, unsteady. A figure emerged from the darkness, barely able to stand. He was human, his uniform torn and stained, his face gaunt. He looked like he had been here for weeks, maybe longer. His gaze flickered between them, desperate but alert. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, breathing heavily. Elias lowered his weapon slightly but didn't holster it. Who are you? The man swayed, his knees threatening to give out, but Mara was already there, catching his arm and keeping him upright. His lips were cracked, his skin pale from dehydration, but there was something else in his expression. Something worse than exhaustion. I was part of the defense force, he muttered. Lieutenant Doran Hale. We fought until we couldn't. Some of us, we tried to run. His voice faltered, his eyes darting toward the darkened hallway behind him. They didn't let us. Elias exchanged a look with Mara. They both knew what that meant. The Zolari didn't take prisoners. What happened here? Elias asked, his voice low. Hale swallowed hard, his breath coming in uneven gasps. They left something behind. His gaze flicked toward the shadows again, and Elias noticed his hands trembling. They don't just destroy. They learn. They watch. And this time they wanted to see how long we would last. A cold weight settled in Elias's chest. The Zolari weren't mindless conquerors. They were patient. Calculated. He had seen their work before, entire colonies wiped out with precision, like test subjects in some grand experiment. But this? Leaving a survivor? That was new. Mara shifted uneasily, her grip tightening on her rifle. We need to get out of here, now. Hale shook his head violently. No, you don't understand. They didn't just leave me. His voice dropped to a whisper. They left something else, and it's still here. The lights flickered again, and Elias's gut told him they were being watched. The ship's sensors had picked up nothing unusual, but something about this station felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. He had seen battlefields before, but this wasn't the aftermath of a fight. It was the remains of a hunt. Then a noise, faint, distant, a scraping sound, metal against metal. Mara spun, her rifle aimed at the corridor behind them. Did you hear that? Elias nodded, his muscles tensing. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was moving in the station. Hale's breathing turned shallow. They left it to see what you do, to see how you'd react. He took a step back, shaking his head. They knew you'd come. Elias's mind raced. If the Zolari had left something behind, it wasn't a mistake. It was bait, and he had walked straight into it. The Resolute's calm crackled to life in his earpiece. Commander, we're picking up motion signatures inside the station, multiple sources. Elias glanced at Mara, who had already switched her rifle to full power. She wasn't waiting for orders. Stay close, he muttered to her, then turned to Hale. Can you walk? Hale nodded weakly. I don't have a choice. The sound of scraping metal grew louder, joined by a faint clicking, almost rhythmic. Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Whatever had been left here wasn't just waiting, it was hunting. And now it knew exactly where they were. The sound grew louder, echoing through the ruined station like nails dragging across metal. Elias motioned for the team to move, his pulse hammering in his ears. They had walked into something carefully designed. Something the Zolari wanted them to find. The only question was whether they were meant to survive it. Hale limped forward, his breath ragged. Mara kept a firm grip on his arm while sweeping her rifle across the corridor. The emergency lights flickered again, casting everything in brief flashes of red and shadow. Elias kept his finger on the trigger, listening, waiting. The clicking sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, calculated. A signal. Back to the Resolute, Elias ordered, his voice low but firm. Now. Mara didn't argue. She half-dragged Hale as they retraced their steps toward the docking bay. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Then, a new sound. A whisper. Low, distorted, inhuman. Elias froze mid-step, and Mara went rigid beside him. Hale's face drained of what little color remained. You hear that? Mara whispered. Elias gave a single nod, scanning the corridor. Nothing. The station's walls were scarred from battle, but the destruction looked deliberate. Patterns burned into metal, symbols etched like scars. Warnings, maybe. Or something worse. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. He turned, weapon raised, but there was nothing, just empty space. A sharp gasp came from Hale. "They're here," he muttered, his eyes darting wildly. "They're watching." Elias felt it too, the kind of presence that pressed against the skin, that made instincts scream even when logic said nothing was there. A burst of static crackled through his earpiece. "Commander, we're detecting an energy shift." The transmission cut out. Elias swore under his breath. The Resolute was still docked, but something was interfering with the signal. The station had been dead moments ago. Now it felt alive. A sound came from the vent above them. Metal creaking, something shifting in the unseen spaces of the station. Elias slowly tilted his head up, muscles tensed. Mara caught on, her grip tightening on her weapon. "Whatever's in here, it's in the walls." Then the lights died completely. Darkness swallowed them. Hale let out a strangled breath. The clicking sound returned, faster now, closing in. A shape burst from the ceiling vent. Elias reacted on instinct, firing into the dark. The flash of his weapon lit up the corridor for a fraction of a second, just enough to see it. Not a Zelari, not fully. It was human. Or it had been. The body was twisted, limbs too long, skin stretched and pale. Its eyes reflected the light like a predator's, black and depthless. And its mouth. Elias fired again. The thing screeched and scuttled backward into the dark, vanishing into the vents. Silence. Hale was shaking. "You saw it," he whispered. "You saw what they did." Mara's voice was tight. "That was a person." Elias exhaled slowly, gripping his rifle. "Not anymore." Hale was staring at the vent, his expression hollow. "They don't just destroy. They change us. They want to know how we work, how we break." Elias cut him off. "Move, now!" They ran. The docking bay wasn't far, but every step felt slower, like something unseen was pressing against them. The Resolute's airlock was in sight. Almost there. Then the emergency sirens blared. Loud, piercing. An alarm that shouldn't have been working. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the station. "Containment breach." Elias's blood ran cold. Something had just been let out. The alarm's deafening wail filled the station, vibrating through the walls like a living thing. Elias barely had time to process it before the lights sputtered back to life, flickering in uneven pulses. The corridor ahead of them stretched toward the airlock, but something felt different now. The station wasn't just reacting, it was waking up. Mara gritted her teeth. Containment breach. What the hell does that mean? Hale's breathing was shallow, his gaze fixed on the vents. "It means whatever they left here isn't trapped anymore." The words sent a chill through Elias. They had seen only a glimpse of the thing in the vent, but if the Ilari had been testing something, experimenting, then that thing wasn't alone. And now they weren't the hunters. They were the prey. The floor beneath them groaned, the station's old metal twisting under unseen pressure. Elias turned sharply as a new sound filled the air. Deep, guttural, almost like breathing. Mara pulled Hale forward, her grip tight. "We have to run. Now." The first explosion rocked the station, a deep tremor somewhere in the distance. The lights cut out again, plunging everything into darkness. Then the screams began. Not human, something else. Multiple voices, layered and unnatural, crawling through the walls like an infection. It was close. Too close. Elias moved. "Go!" They sprinted for the airlock, footsteps pounding against metal. Elias could feel it behind them, something massive, shifting in the darkness, moving faster than it should. Hale stumbled, his leg giving out. Mara caught him, but the delay was enough. A shape lunged from the shadows behind them, long, jagged limbs scraping against the floor. Its body twisted unnaturally, moving like something that had forgotten how to be human. Elias fired without thinking. The creature shrieked, its body jerking back, but it didn't fall. It adapted, shifting, learning. The Resolute's outer doors loomed ahead, the only thing between them and escape. Mara hauled Hale forward, her rifle swinging toward the creature. "Heal us!" He didn't hesitate. He turned, threw his last grenade down the corridor, and ran. The explosion roared behind them, heat licking at his back. The creature's screech was lost in the chaos. Mara slammed her fist against the airlock controls. "Open, open, open!" The doors hissed apart. They stumbled inside just as something hit the outer hull, a heavy impact that rattled the ship. Elias turned, catching one last glimpse of the station's darkened hallway. The shadows moved, twisting, reaching. The thing in the vent hadn't been the only one. The Resolute tore free from the docking clamps, engines burning hot. Elias barely made it to the bridge before the station's final warning blared over their comms. "Containment compromised. Evacuation failure. Experiment complete." And then the station began to fall apart. The Resolute pulled away from the station, engines roaring as the structure behind them buckled under its own failure. Fires erupted along its hull, spilling debris into the void. Elias barely had time to catch his breath before the last transmission echoed through the ship's comms. "Experiment complete." The words settled like a weight in his chest. The Zelari hadn't failed. The station hadn't been abandoned. It had been a test, and now the test was over. Mara's hands flew across the controls, scanning for threats. "We need to get distance. Now!" Elias turned to Hale, who was slumped against a console, his face pale with exhaustion. "What did they do to you?" His voice was steady, but the question held an edge. He had seen the look in Hale's eyes back in that station. He knew when someone was hiding something. Hale exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. "I wasn't the only one they left behind. There were others. Some made it longer than I did." His voice dropped. "But none of us left the same." Elias's grip tightened on the console. "What do you mean?" Hale didn't answer. He just looked down at his trembling hands, his fingers twitching like something unseen was crawling under his skin. A proximity alarm blared through the bridge. Mara swore, snapping her head to the sensor readings. "We've got movement!" Elias turned toward the viewport. The station was collapsing, but something else was emerging from the wreckage. Shapes drifted in the debris, moving with eerie coordination. They weren't ships. They weren't escape pods. They were bodies. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Twisted, broken forms floating in zero gravity, their limbs elongated, their faces hollow. Some had once been human. Some had been something else entirely, and they were moving. "Engaging weapons!" Mara shouted, locking onto the nearest cluster. The ship's cannons fired, tearing through the drifting forms, but it didn't stop them. They weren't just floating, they were chasing. Elias's stomach turned. "Full burn, now!" The engines flared, pushing the Resolute into high-speed retreat. But the things outside followed, undeterred by the vacuum of space. Then Hale gasped, a sharp, strangled sound. Elias turned just in time to see him convulse, his fingers digging into the metal floor. His veins pulsed dark beneath his skin, like something was moving inside him. His breath hitched. They put something in us." Mara took a step back, her weapon halfway raised. "Elias." Hale let out a choked sound, half a scream, half a growl. His body seized, his eyes flickering between terror and something else, and in that moment, Elias knew. The experiment hadn't been about the creatures. It hadn't been about the station. It had been about them, and they had already brought it aboard. Hale's body convulsed violently, his fingers clawing at his chest like he could rip something out. His breathing turned ragged, his eyes unfocused, shifting between terror and something other. Elias took a slow step forward, but Mara's rifle was already aimed at Hale's head. "Elias!" she warned, voice tight. Hale gasped, his body shuddering. I can feel it," he choked out. "It's not just me, it's all of us." His trembling fingers gripped the edge of a console, leaving deep indents in the metal. Too deep, too strong. Elias didn't want to believe it, but the truth was staring him in the face. The Zelari never abandoned experiments. They released them. Hale wasn't just infected. He was changing, and if he wasn't the only one, The proximity alarm blared again. Mara cursed, spinning the sensors to full range. More of them were coming, drifting through space like silent predators. The wreckage of the station had scattered, but the things inside hadn't died with it. They had been set free, and now they were multiplying. Hale groaned, dropping to his knees. "They're in my head," he whispered. "I can hear them." Elias clenched his jaw. "Mara, get the medbay sealed, now!" She didn't lower her rifle. "We can't take that risk, Elias." Hale's breath came in short gasps. His veins pulsed darker, his fingers twitching like they didn't belong to him anymore. He locked eyes with Elias, something desperate in his expression. "Kill me before I become one of them." Elias hesitated. Then the ship lurched, a deep impact rocking the hull. The things outside were trying to get in. The lights flickered, and Elias knew they were out of time. Hale let out a strangled gasp, his body jerking again, but instead of lunging, he forced himself still, sweat dripping from his forehead. "I think I can fight it," he rasped. His body was shaking, but his voice, his mind, was still his own. Elias made a choice. He grabbed a sedative from the emergency kit and injected it into Hale's arm before Mara could stop him. Hale's body sagged, his breath slowing, but the dark veins didn't fade. Mara exhaled sharply. "This is a mistake." Elias didn't answer. He turned back to the controls, his fingers moving fast. "We can't fight them all, but we can stop them from spreading." The Resolute's engines roared to full power. Elias steered hard toward the nearest gravity well, one of the system's dead moons. The plan was simple. They would burn every last ounce of fuel and slam the infected wreckage into the surface at high velocity. If they couldn't kill the creatures in open space, they would bury them. The creatures outside moved faster, sensing what was happening. They clawed toward the ship, their hollow eyes fixed on the humans inside. Elias held steady. The Resolute dove toward the barren moon, dragging the swarm with it. The gravitational pull increased, drawing the infected wreckage into its death spiral. Elias waited until the last second, until the creatures were too close to escape. Then he fired the emergency thrusters, pulling the Resolute away in a brutal last-minute maneuver. The wreckage plummeted. The creatures followed. The impact was a silent explosion in the void, but the shockwave rippled through space. The dust rose high, swallowing the twisted remains. Whatever had been inside the station, whatever the Zalari had made, was buried beneath miles of rock and ice. Silence fell over the ship. The sensors cleared. The danger was gone. Mara let out a long breath, lowering her rifle. "That was reckless," Elias exhaled. "It worked." Then a quiet sound made them both turn. Hale. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment he was still. Then he looked down at his hands. The dark veins were gone, his breathing evened out, his pulse steadied. He blinked, looking at Elias. I think I'm okay." Elias didn't move. Mara's fingers hovered near her weapon. "That's not possible." Hale swallowed, flexing his fingers. Maybe it didn't take." His voice was his own again. "Maybe I fought it off." Elias wanted to believe it, but deep down, he knew. The Zalari never failed. They learned, and this time they had left something behind. Silence hung heavy in the cockpit. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ship's systems recalibrating after the violent maneuver. The wreckage was gone, buried beneath miles of rock, and the creatures, whatever they had become, were trapped beneath the surface. The mission was over. They had survived, but Elias couldn't shake the unease twisting in his gut. He watched Hale closely, searching for any lingering signs of infection. The dark veins had vanished, his breathing was normal, and his eyes, clear and steady, were his own again, for now. Mara stepped back, lowering her rifle fully for the first time. "We should run more scans," she said, her voice careful. "Just to be sure." Hale gave a tired smile. I get it. If it were either of you, I'd feel the same way. He stretched his fingers again, turning his hands over like he was still trying to convince himself. But I swear, it's gone. Whatever was in me, I fought it off. Elias nodded slowly, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. They had seen what those things could do, how they changed people, and no one had ever walked away from it. Mara ran a diagnostic on the ship, muttering under her breath, We burned through most of our fuel with that stunt. We'll need to send a distress signal. Elias exhaled. Do it, let's get out of here. She nodded and turned to the controls, but Hale hesitated, his brow furrowed, a shadow passing over his face. Do you really think it's over? Elias glanced at him. We stopped them from spreading? But did we stop it? Hale asked quietly. The Exelari don't just make weapons, they make life, and life doesn't just die because we want it to. The words lingered between them. Elias didn't have an answer. He wanted to believe they had stopped whatever the Zalyari had created, but deep down he knew their mission hadn't ended in victory. It had ended in containment. For now. Mara sent out the distress signal, and the ship's comms crackled as the automated beacon activated. They would be found soon, pulled back to human space, away from this nightmare. Hale leaned back, exhaustion catching up with him. You know, I was sure I wasn't getting out of there alive. He exhaled a weak chuckle. Guess I got lucky. Elias forced a smile. Yeah, lucky. The Resolute drifted through the quiet void, leaving the dead moon and its buried horrors behind. But as Elias sat back in his chair, hands still gripping the armrests, he couldn't shake the thought gnawing at the back of his mind. The Exilari never abandoned failed experiments. They only abandoned successful ones, and this time they hadn't needed to take anything with them, because they had left something behind.